Here's a approximately 1,000-word analysis of American Godfathers, The Five Families, Season 1, Episode, NYC Mafia's Mob Tax, focusing on how the New York Mafia's so-called mob tax system worked, why it mattered, and what it reveals about power, business and fear in that era. In the early decades of the post-war era, the New York criminal underworld transformed from chaotic street fighting into a sophisticated form of organized crime. Central to this metamorphosis were the five mafia families of New York: the Gambino crime family, Genovese crime family, Lucchese crime family, Bonanno crime family and Colombo crime family, which came to dominate entire sectors of business, politics and labor. The episode, Mob Tax, shows one of the cleverest and most intrusive ways they extracted money, by imposing a kind of tax on legitimate businesses and rackets alike, extracting profits not simply by controlling businesses, but by making those businesses pay for protection, or turn over a slice of their revenue under duress. The term, mob tax, is not literal taxation in the legal sense, but extortion disguised as business cost. You run a trucking company, a construction firm, a union-catered enterprise, or a waste-hauling outfit in New York, and quietly you are expected to pay the mafia family your territory's cut. Failure to comply brings intimidation, violence, union problems, or being shut out of contracts. The episode details how such payments proliferated, by embedding mobsters into trade unions, dominating contract work, rigging bids, and then using those levers to require non-mob firms to pay just to operate. In short, the businesses became subservient nodes in a network of mafia influence. Why did this tax system become so powerful? A few key reasons. 1. The mafia already had strong institutional reach through labor, construction, garbage collection, trucking and other industries that were hard to police. 2. They built the mechanism of fear and silence, omerta, that made paying easier than resisting. 3. Compared with overt robbery or violent hijackings, this tax system was repetitive, low risk and high yield. As one historian quoted in the series explains, they didn't rob banks, they didn't have to. The episode illustrates several concrete case studies: firms forced to pay kickbacks to win union contracts, trucking firms whose union bosses were mafia-influenced and would block access to docks unless fees were paid, and construction companies that found themselves with inflated costs once a mafia family took control of the subcontractors, labor and supply chain. Through these mechanisms, the families turned legitimate industry into branch offices of crime, laundering money, taking profits and manipulating markets. For example, the Gambino family under Carlo Gambino is shown as particularly emblematic. Gambino's rise to power also corresponded with his family's stranglehold over the New York waterfront, trucking, and union contracts. One New York Times article cited in the series described how Gambino gained mob tax with fear. That phrase neatly captures the dynamic: pay to the family, or suffer the consequence of having your business rendered unviable. What made it dangerous for victims and effective for the mafia was the combination of legal legitimate facade plus extra-legal threat. On one hand, a company is dealing with union fees, contract negotiations, bidding wars. On the other hand, behind the scenes a mob associate is saying, "You'll pay X, or we'll make sure your workers strike, your truck drivers get subpoenaed, or one of your suppliers disappears." Over time, this dual pressure builds a systematic flow of revenue for the family, often invisible in official books because payments were disguised as consulting fees, or union landscaping costs, or were simply slush funds. The episode also shows how the federal government responded. The introduction of the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, in the 1970s and 1980s gave prosecutors the ability to link multiple acts of extortion, racketeering, union corruption and murder into one legal net. With RICO, the mob tax systems that once seemed embedded in the economy became prosecutable as part of an overarching criminal enterprise. The families found themselves having to adapt: more offshore accounts, more subtle payment channels, but the same patterns remained. In dissecting the episode's themes, several lessons stand out. 1. Power through control of legitimate industries. The mafia wasn't simply a street gang of armed robbers. By controlling legitimate labor sectors, contract flows and supply chains, they were able to extract value from the economy at large. This is central in the series. The five families' power lay not only in violence but in the infrastructure of business. When businesses become dependent on union approval, licensing, municipal contracts, the mafia could interject and require payment simply for access. 2. Fear and reputation as enforcement mechanisms. Physical violence was only part of the toolset. More powerful was the reputation of pay or else, backed by assassinations or disappearances. The episode sketches how a small construction firm might think, better to pay quietly than risk a shutdown, losing bids, or workers intimidated into walking off the job. That risk calculus turns into steady revenue for the criminals. 3. Blur between legal and illegal. The mob tax operated in the gray zone, seemingly legal business contracts, unions, truck leases, services, all with concealed extortion embedded. That blur made enforcement by law enforcement more difficult, because victims often feared retaliation, and many documents looked legitimate. This was a major theme in the docuseries, how the families turned the economy into a money machine. 4. Adaptation under pressure. Once the government began major prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s, thanks to RICO and other federal laws, the families had to evolve. The episode shows that they shifting from overt territory control to more sanitized, consulting, models, offshore holdings, and infiltration of legitimate businesses globally. The mob tax didn't vanish, it just got more sophisticated. The significance of this system is not just historical curiosity, it reshaped parts of the New York economy. Some industries had artificially inflated costs because of extortion, some bidders lost business because they refused to play the game, some companies went under because they couldn't keep up the payments. Behind the scenes, what looked like high overhead, union issues or supply chain problems were sometimes the cost of paying the mafia families cut. What the episode also subtly underscores is the human cost: families of business owners under intimidation, workers caught between union corruption and fear, communities where legitimate opportunities were strangled by crime's infiltration. It's not glamorous, it's insidious. In its broader context, mob tax exemplifies how organized crime can be more than street violence or drug trafficking. It can be systemic, embedded in everyday commerce. The flywheel is simple. Control critical nodes: trucking, construction, unions. Right-pointing arrow impose payment for access. Right-pointing arrow funnel profits. Right-pointing arrow use part of profits to maintain control. Bribes, hits, influence. Right-pointing arrow repeat. The five families reaped enormous sums from this architecture. However, the episode makes clear that this architecture wasn't invulnerable. When enough businesses got fed up, when informants started talking, when federal agents lined up cases under RICO, the family's protection net weakened. Capturing the economics of enterprise rather than simply the violent act became the prosecution strategy. And since paying the mob tax left traces, even if hidden, eventual breakdown was possible. In conclusion, the mob tax, explored in the episode, is a master class in organized corruption, not simply extortion but integration into the economy. It reveals how the mafia transformed from brute force to structural power, how businesses became nodes in a criminal network, and how the interplay of fear, union control and business dependence allowed the families to extract huge flows of money. The documentary episode illustrates how once seemingly untouchable crime empires were brought low by law enforcement's shift from chasing bullets to chasing books and hidden payment streams. For anyone interested in how organized crime operates not just on the street but in boardrooms, this portion of the series is stark and illuminating. If you like, I can pull out 5 key case studies from the episode with dates, names, companies, and summarize their outcomes. Would you like me to do that? In the heart of New York City's post-war boom, legitimate commerce and organized crime became indistinguishable. The documentary American Godfathers, The Five Families reveals that the mafia's genius was not just in violence but in its ability to institutionalize crime into a business model. At the center of this system was the mob tax, an informal, illegal levy imposed by the five families on countless industries across the city. The so-called tax was both simple and devastating. Any business operating in mafia territory, construction, garbage collection, trucking, docks, unions, restaurants, had to pay a percentage of earnings to the controlling family. In exchange, they received protection, but not from outside threats. The protection was from the mob itself. Refusing to pay meant work stoppages, strikes, vandalism, or worse. It was extortion dressed in the language of business. The five families, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, turned New York into a patchwork of economic fiefdoms. Each family controlled specific industries and territories, collaborating when profitable and warring when power shifted. By infiltrating trade unions and securing key city contracts, they positioned themselves as silent partners in the city's infrastructure. When a developer needed concrete for a skyscraper, when garbage needed hauling, or when a trucking route required approval, a hidden tax was often added to the cost. The documentary traces this strategy back to the post-prohibition years, when bootlegging profits dried up and mobsters needed new income sources. Rather than rely solely on vice rackets like gambling or prostitution, they realized that legitimate business could offer steady, long-term profit, if they could control it. Through the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, longshoremen's unions, and construction guilds, mafia families installed loyal union bosses who acted as their enforcers. Carlo Gambino, one of the era's most calculating bosses, perfected this system. His family's influence over the garment district, trucking routes, and labor unions allowed them to demand payments with minimal bloodshed. The threat of violence was enough, rarely did it have to be used. They didn't rob banks, they taxed them, one FBI agent says in the series. The brilliance of the mob tax lay in its subtlety. No open gunfire, no chaos, just quiet dominance that every business understood but few dared to challenge. By the 1960s, this invisible tax had become a cost of doing business in New York. Construction firms padded bids to include mafia payments, restaurant suppliers inflated prices, garbage haulers shared cuts with consultants, who were really mob lieutenants. Even major developers, some of the city's wealthiest men, were aware of the mafia's presence but chose to pay to keep projects running smoothly. The mob had created a parallel government, one that issued no invoices but collected faithfully. This shadow economy thrived because it offered something government couldn't: efficiency through fear. Workers didn't strike when the mafia said no, contracts moved when the mob approved. The families acted as invisible regulators, ensuring loyalty and profit across industries. For decades, this system made the five families untouchable, until the law learned to fight crime not on the street, but in the books. Part 2, Breaking the System, RICO, Informants, and the Fall of the Mob Tax. The second half of American Godfathers, The Five Families examines how the same structure that made the mob tax successful, its dependence on hierarchy, loyalty, and secrecy, eventually led to its downfall. By the late 1970s, federal law enforcement had begun to grasp the scope of organized crime's reach. The turning point came with the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970 but fully weaponized in the 1980s. RICO allowed prosecutors to connect a series of individual crimes, bribery, extortion, money laundering, into one grand conspiracy charge. Suddenly, bosses who had insulated themselves from street-level crime could be charged as heads of a criminal enterprise. The same organizational structure that had kept the mob efficient now made it legally vulnerable. The episode recounts how FBI wiretaps, undercover agents, and financial audits began unraveling the web of payments that defined the mob tax. One by one, corrupt union leaders turned informant, detailing how consulting fees and labor peace payments flowed to mob families. The Teamsters, once a proud labor force, became synonymous with mafia manipulation. In construction, no-show jobs and padded contracts revealed decades of embedded extortion. As indictments piled up in the 1980s, the myth of invincibility cracked. The famous commission case of 1985 struck the heart of mafia leadership, charging bosses from all five families for collectively running New York's underworld. The evidence, including secret recordings and financial ledgers, proved what the mob tax truly was: an organized system of theft disguised as partnership. The economic consequences were significant. With union corruption exposed and mobsters jailed, legitimate companies began operating without fear of coercion. But the transition wasn't seamless. Many businesses had grown dependent on the order that mafia oversight provided. Strikes, competition, and chaos briefly surged as industries adjusted to the loss of their criminal regulators. The mob's control had been perverse, but effective. Its removal left a vacuum that the city had to rebuild from scratch. Culturally, the fall of the mob tax marked the end of an era. The five families no longer ruled openly, but their legend endured. Even as the old guard died or went to prison, younger associates tried to replicate the system in smaller, subtler ways, through front companies, offshore accounts, and digital laundering. Yet none could recreate the scale or authority of the mid-century mafia. The unspoken tax that once governed the city's economy had become too visible to survive. The documentary closes with a reflection. The mafia's genius was in understanding human nature, the desire for protection, stability, and profit. By offering these things outside the law, they blurred the line between criminal and businessman. For decades, many New Yorkers viewed the mob not as invaders but as part of the city's fabric, dangerous, yes, but dependable. Today, remnants of that world linger in whispers and old photographs. The skyscrapers built under mob influence still stand, the streets once taxed by fear now bustle with tourists unaware of the blood,